So late Friday night, authorities descended on a home less than 2 miles from the Nancy Guthrie home in Tucson, Arizona. 3 people are detained, we understand. They are being questioned in relation to the disappearance of Savannah Guthrie's mother. Joining us now live from the scene
Before this became a story about encrypted apps, deleted chats, and FBI forensic analysis, it was about one woman who disappeared and a family left searching for answers. That is what makes the Nancy Guthrie case different from the endless rumors surrounding it online. Because underneath all the speculation is one simple question: what really happened to Nancy? According to the materials surrounding the case, investigators reportedly became interested in digital activity connected to devices associated with Tommaso. But the focus may not have been the messages themselves in modern investigations. What matters just as much is what someone tries to erase. Most people think deleted data disappears forever. It doesn't always work that way. Phones constantly record background behavior. Apps open and close. Devices connect to networks. Systems track timestamps and location activity. Even when conversations vanish from the screen, traces of behavior can still remain buried inside the device. And that idea may now sit at the center of this case. According to reports being discussed online, investigators reportedly examined activity connected to encrypted platforms like Telegram, not necessarily to recover every deleted message, but to study patterns. When was the app active? When did the phone suddenly go quiet? And did those changes overlap with the critical timeline of Nancy's disappearance? That is where the story becomes harder to ignore. Because investigators do not look at digital evidence alone. They compare it to physical events, surveillance systems, vehicle movement, communication gaps, moments where normal behavior suddenly changes. And according to the materials surrounding the investigation, some of those patterns may have raised serious questions. But it is important to stay careful here. A deleted message is not proof of a crime. A wiped device does not automatically establish guilt. Real investigations move slowly, and every digital clue still has to be tested against evidence that can hold up legally. Still, one detail continues drawing attention in the Nancy Guthrie case: the timing. Because according to the material now circulating around the investigation, the phone may not have gone completely silent after all. The visible activity disappeared. But underneath that silence, another layer of behavior may still have been running in the background. And in cases like this, that hidden layer is sometimes where investigators start looking the closest. According to the materials surrounding the case, investigators reportedly focused on something forensic analysts sometimes call behavioral traces. Not the content of a conversation, the behavior around it. Because even when someone deletes messages, the phone itself may still record signs that activity happened. An app opening at unusual hours, sudden spikes in data transfer, encrypted sessions starting and stopping within very specific windows of time. Those fragments may not tell investigators exactly what was said, but they can help establish patterns. And in the Nancy Guthrie case, the pattern is what continues drawing attention. Reports suggest investigators may have compared digital activity against the physical timeline surrounding Nancy's disappearance. That includes surveillance gaps, communication changes, and periods where normal device behavior reportedly shifted. At first, a quiet phone may not sound suspicious, but investigators often pay attention when silence appears selective. For example, if regular apps suddenly stop showing activity while encrypted services remain active in the background, that contrast can become important, especially if it overlaps with key moments investigators are already examining. According to the material being discussed, this is where the case reportedly started becoming more serious from a digital forensic standpoint. Not because one dramatic clue suddenly solved everything, but because multiple small details may have started aligning. And that is often how major investigations work, not through one perfect piece of evidence, but through layers. A timestamp here, a deleted gap there, a location signal that does not fully match the public story. On their own, those details may mean very little. Together, investigators may see something different. But the next part of this story may be the most important one yet. Because if digital activity really did overlap with critical moments in the timeline, investigators would naturally ask another question. Did the device leave behind location traces too? If investigators can establish when a device was active, the next question becomes even more important. Where was it moving? Because smartphones rarely stop communicating completely. Even when visible apps are closed, devices still search for nearby towers, Wi-Fi networks, and background connections. That invisible activity can sometimes create a rough map of movement. And according to the material surrounding the Nancy Guthrie case, this may be one of the most heavily discussed parts of the investigation. Reports suggest investigators reportedly examined hidden location behavior connected to the device activity timeline. Not necessarily a perfect GPS trail, but fragments, connection attempts, network handshakes, background pings that may help narrow down movement during critical hours. If accurate, that matters for one reason above all others. It could help investigators compare digital movement against the known physical timeline of the case. And this is where digital evidence becomes more than just technical data. It becomes a way of testing stories. Because if a phone appears in places it was not expected to be, or if movement patterns do not match public explanations, investigators naturally begin asking harder questions. Still, this is also where caution matters most. Location data is powerful, but it is not magic. Signals can be incomplete. Timelines can be misunderstood. And investigators still have to connect digital evidence with physical proof, witness statements, and legally verified findings. But according to the reports being discussed, the reason this digital evidence continues attracting attention is because multiple layers may have started pointing in the same direction. Not one clue, several, and in major investigations. That is usually the moment when a case begins shifting from theory to serious scrutiny. But there is another reason people continue following this story so closely. Because the deeper investigators reportedly looked into the digital timeline, the more attention turned toward the people closest to Nancy. And that introduces a much more difficult question. Not just what happened, but who may have known more than they initially appeared to. As attention around the Nancy Guthrie case intensified, online discussions slowly shifted beyond digital evidence alone. People began asking a harder question. Who inside Nancy's circle may have known more than investigators first believed? According to the materials surrounding the case, investigators reportedly reviewed communications, financial activity, and timeline overlaps connected to individuals close to Nancy, including Annie and Tommaso. But it is important to be careful here, because public suspicion and verified evidence are not the same thing. In cases involving family members, investigators routinely examine the people closest to the victim. That does not automatically mean guilt. It means proximity. And sometimes proximity creates difficult questions. Reports suggest investigators may have looked for overlaps between device activity, location patterns, and communication gaps during critical periods tied to Nancy's disappearance. If accurate, the goal would not simply be to accuse someone. It would be to understand whether anyone had knowledge of events before or after Nancy vanished. That distinction matters, because one of the biggest dangers in true crime cases is turning uncertainty into certainty before the evidence supports it. Still, according to the material being discussed, investigators reportedly became increasingly interested in whether the digital timeline pointed toward coordination rather than isolated behavior. Not necessarily a dramatic conspiracy, but the possibility that more than one person may have understood pieces of what was happening. And if investigators truly believe that encrypted communication, deleted activity, and synchronized timing were connected, the case would naturally become much larger than one missing phone or one missing message. It would become a question of intent. Who was communicating? Who was aware? Who was trying to hide activity? And who may have stayed silent at the exact moment investigators now consider critical. But according to many following the case, the most unsettling part may not be what investigators reportedly found. It may be what someone allegedly tried to remove before investigators ever got there. According to the materials surrounding the Nancy Guthrie case, one detail reportedly stood out to investigators more than almost anything else: the deletion pattern. Because forensic analysts often distinguish between normal phone cleanup and highly selective removal of data. Most people delete things randomly over time. Photos, old messages, unused apps, storage clutter. But when specific windows of activity disappear while unrelated data remains untouched, investigators may view that differently. Reports surrounding the case suggest there may have been unusual gaps connected to critical periods in the timeline. If accurate, that does not automatically prove criminal intent. But investigators often ask why certain moments appear cleaner than others. And sometimes, the attempt to erase activity becomes more noticeable than the activity itself. That idea may explain why digital forensic analysis reportedly became such a major focus in this case, because modern investigations are no longer limited to visible evidence. Analysts can study metadata, system behavior, connection attempts, and background activity that most users never even realize their phone's record. And according to the reports being discussed, investigators may have used those fragments to reconstruct parts of the timeline surrounding Nancy S. disappearance. Not perfectly, but enough to raise larger questions. Questions about communication, questions about movement, and questions about whether someone believed deleting information would permanently remove the truth. But the deeper this story goes, the more important another distinction becomes. Digital evidence alone cannot close a case. Investigators still need physical evidence, verified timelines, witness testimony, and legally supported conclusions. Without that foundation, speculation can quickly outrun reality. Still, many following the case believe the digital side of the investigation may have changed one thing permanently: the direction. Because according to the material surrounding the case, investigators reportedly no longer viewed the disappearance as random confusion or isolated coincidence. They may have started viewing it as a sequence of behavior. And if that sequence truly exists, investigators may now be closer than ever to understanding what really happened during the hours Nancy Guthrie disappeared. As the investigation continued, many people online focused on one major possibility. What if the digital evidence was pointing towards something larger than one individual? According to the material surrounding the Nancy Guthrie case, investigators reportedly explored whether encrypted communication and coordinated deletion patterns suggested outside involvement. Some reports even described the possibility of a wider network or organized coordination behind the scenes. But this is where the story requires the most caution, because terms like criminal network can quickly become sensationalized online. Investigators may explore possibilities during an active case without confirming them publicly. Exploring a theory is not the same as proving it. Still, according to the reports being discussed, investigators allegedly became interested in whether multiple devices, communications, or movements showed signs of coordination during the timeline connected to Nancy S. disappearance. If accurate, that would explain why digital forensics became such a central focus, because phones do more than store conversations. They connect people, they establish timing, they reveal patterns of contact, and sometimes they expose relationships that were never intended to be visible. But even if investigators are building a larger picture from digital evidence, one fact remains at the center of everything. Nancy Guthrie is still the reason this investigation matters, not the technology, not the headlines, not the online theories. The real purpose of every forensic review, every timeline reconstruction, and every digital analysis is to answer the same question that has existed from the beginning. Where is Nancy? And according to many following the case, that may be why the reported location data has drawn so much attention. Because if investigators truly recovered movement patterns or hidden device traces, those details could potentially help narrow search areas or confirm key parts of the timeline for a family waiting for answers. That possibility matters more than any headline ever could, because in missing person cases, uncertainty can become its own kind of trauma. Not knowing what happened, not knowing who knew something, not knowing whether the truth is still hidden somewhere inside details. Investigators are only now beginning to understand. And that may ultimately become the biggest lesson from the Nancy Guthrie case, that in the modern world, people can delete messages, wipe devices, and hide conversations. But sometimes the technology they rely on still remembers enough to tell part of the story. But there is one final detail that may matter more than all the encrypted chats, deleted timestamps, and hidden metadata combined: intent. Because investigators are rarely trying to prove that a phone was simply active. They are trying to understand why certain actions happened when they did. Why did communication reportedly change during critical hours? Why were specific periods allegedly cleaned more carefully than others? And why do some patterns appear to overlap so closely with the timeline investigators are examining? Those are the questions that continue driving attention toward the digital side of the Nancy Guthrie case. But even now, there are still limits to what the public truly knows. Much of the discussion surrounding the investigation comes from reports, interpretations, and online analysis rather than fully released official findings. That distinction is important because public pressure can easily transform possibility into assumption. And in cases like this, assumptions can damage the search for the truth just as much as silence can. Still, according to the materials surrounding the case, many believe investigators may now have enough digital information to reconstruct at least part of what happened during the critical timeline connected to Nancy's disappearance. Not necessarily every detail, not every conversation, but perhaps enough to understand movement, communication patterns, and whether certain actions were deliberate rather than accidental. And if that is true, then the most powerful part of this investigation may not be one dramatic breakthrough. It may be the accumulation of small details that slowly stop making sense when placed together. A silent phone, encrypted activity, missing gaps, background movement, selective deletion. On their own, each detail can be explained away. Together, they may tell investigators something very different, and that may ultimately become the real story behind the Nancy Guthrie case. Not that technology solved everything overnight, but that even in a world built around disappearing messages and encrypted communication, traces of behavior can still remain behind long enough for investigators to start asking the right questions. And sometimes, asking the right questions is what finally leads investigators toward the truth. At the center of every theory, every forensic report, and every online discussion is a reality that should never be forgotten. A woman disappeared. And somewhere behind all the digital traces, speculation, and unanswered questions, there is still a family waiting for clarity. That is why cases like this continue holding public attention for so long. Not because people are fascinated by encrypted apps or forensic software, but because everyone understands the fear of not knowing where someone went, not knowing who may have been telling the truth, not knowing whether the answers were hidden inside ordinary details people almost ignored at first. According to the materials surrounding the Nancy Guthrie case, investigators reportedly believe digital evidence may help narrow timelines and expose inconsistencies that were not obvious in the beginning. If accurate, that does not mean the case is solved. It means investigators may finally have a clearer direction than they had before. And sometimes direction changes everything, because many major investigations are not broken open by one shocking discovery. They are solved when multiple small details finally begin aligning in a way that can no longer be dismissed as coincidence. A timestamp, a location ping, a deleted gap, a silent period that suddenly matters more after investigators compare it to the physical timeline. That appears to be why so much attention has remained focused on the digital side of this case. Not because technology replaces evidence, but because technology may preserve behavior people believed had disappeared forever. Still, the most important thing moving forward is patience. Real investigations take time. Evidence has to be verified. Timelines have to be tested. And public theories should never be mistaken for confirmed conclusions. Because the goal should never be to force a dramatic story. The goal should be the truth, whatever that truth ultimately turns out to be. And if this case has shown anything, it may be this. In the modern world, people can erase conversations, wipe devices, and attempt to disappear behind encrypted communication. But sometimes the smallest digital traces left behind become impossible to completely silence. And for investigators searching for answers in the Nancy Guthrie case, those traces may eventually help reveal what really happened. In the end, the Nancy Guthrie case may become more than a story about missing data, encrypted communication, or forensic technology. It may become a reminder of how modern investigations now work in two worlds at the same time. The physical world investigators can see, and the digital world people believe they can erase. According to the material surrounding this case, investigators reportedly focused on the possibility that hidden device activity, metadata, and location behavior could help reconstruct parts of the timeline connected to Nancy's disappearance. If accurate, that kind of analysis may eventually help answer questions that once seemed impossible to approach. But technology alone is never the full answer. Evidence still needs context, patterns still need explanation, and every theory still has to survive the standards of a real investigation. That is why the most responsible way to follow a case like this is with patience, caution, and respect for the people at the center of it. Because behind every headline is still a family living with uncertainty. And behind every digital clue is the hope that one day the truth becomes clear enough to finally bring answers. Whether those answers come from forensic analysis, witness testimony, physical evidence, or a combination of all three, the goal remains the same: to understand what really happened to Nancy Guthrie. And perhaps that is the biggest lesson from this entire story. People often think the most dangerous evidence is what investigators find. But sometimes the evidence that matters most is what someone tried hardest to make disappear. If you have followed this case closely, share your thoughts respectfully below. Not rumors, not accusations, just your honest perspective on what questions investigators still need to answer. And if you believe cases like this deserve careful attention rather than noise and speculation, stay with the channel for future investigations focused on evidence, timelines, and the search for truth.